It begins as a normal conversation, until one quiet moment suddenly changes everything on live television. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not through shouting or dramatic walk-offs, but through firm questions, careful interruptions, and a noticeable shift in tone that everyone in the studio can feel. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. Chris Evans took his seat at the table with the kind of relaxed posture viewers have come to expect from him during daytime television appearances. The segment was promoted as a wide-ranging conversation, touching on his latest project, his public image, and his occasional comments about social responsibility in interviews. From the start, the mood in the studio felt light and conversational. There was polite laughter, easy eye contact between Evans and the hosts, and the familiar rhythm of a morning talk show settling into place. The hosts moved through introductory questions smoothly, allowing Evans to speak at length, nodding along as he explained why this particular project mattered to him and what drew him to it creatively. As the conversation unfolded, Sunny Hostin leaned forward slightly in her chair, signaling a shift that longtime viewers of the show would recognize. Her expression remained calm and attentive, but her posture suggested she was preparing to steer the discussion somewhere more pointed. The topic turned toward comments Evans had made in a recent interview, where he spoke broadly about public responsibility, civic engagement, and the role of celebrities in shaping conversations beyond entertainment. It was framed initially as a chance for him to clarify his perspective, and Evans responded in measured terms, emphasizing that he never intended to tell anyone how to think or vote, only to encourage people to stay informed and engaged. At this stage, the exchange still felt balanced and respectful. Other hosts interjected briefly, offering affirming remarks or light follow-up questions, keeping the tone accessible for a daytime audience. The studio audience listened quietly, with occasional murmurs of agreement or soft applause when Evans spoke about unity and respectful dialogue. There was nothing outwardly tense yet, but the pacing of the segment began to slow, as if everyone at the table sensed the conversation was moving into more serious territory. Sunny Hostin then posed a more direct question, carefully worded but unmistakably challenging. She referenced the reality that not all viewers receive celebrity commentary in the same way, and that some feel talked down to when public figures weigh in on social issues. Her voice remained even, but her words carried weight. She asked Evans how he reconciled encouraging civic engagement with the perception that celebrities sometimes speak from a place of privilege that doesn't reflect the everyday experiences of many Americans. Evans paused before answering, a brief but noticeable moment where he looked down at the table and then back up toward Hostin. It was the kind of pause that reads clearly on live television, not awkward, but thoughtful. He acknowledged the concern, saying he understood why people might feel that way and that he tried to be mindful of his platform. He explained that his intention was never to lecture, but to participate as a citizen who happens to have visibility. As he spoke, Hostin listened closely, her head tilted slightly, her expression neutral but intent. When Evans finished, she followed up almost immediately, pressing the point further. She noted that intention and impact don't always align, and that for some viewers, hearing messages about responsibility from wealthy celebrities can feel disconnected from their lived reality. This was the moment where the tone at the table subtly shifted. The other hosts became quieter, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. The studio audience also seemed to lean in, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond surface-level discussion. Evans responded calmly, but his body language changed. He sat a bit straighter, his hands now resting together rather than gesturing loosely. His voice remained steady, but there was a firmness in his phrasing as he reiterated that he never claimed to have all the answers. He emphasized listening as much as speaking, and said that he welcomed criticism when it was offered in good faith. The exchange was still respectful, but the rhythm of polite talk show banter had given way to something more deliberate and focused. Sunny Hostin acknowledged his point, but didn't fully concede. She pointed out that on a show like theirs, with a broad daytime audience, these conversations land differently depending on who is watching. She asked whether Evans thought celebrities should sometimes step back rather than speak, especially when discussions involve communities they may not personally represent. Her tone was not confrontational, but it was firm, and the question hung in the air longer than the lighter ones that came before. At this point, one of the other hosts attempted to soften the moment with a brief interjection, suggesting that the issue was complicated and that multiple perspectives could coexist. The comment earned a small ripple of applause from the audience, momentarily easing the tension. Still, the focus quickly returned to Evans and Hostin, as Evans responded by saying he believed silence could also be interpreted as indifference. He stressed that his goal was to encourage participation, not dictate outcomes. The audience reaction was mixed but restrained, with a few scattered claps and some quiet murmurs. There was no sense of the studio turning against either side, but rather an acknowledgement that the conversation had touched on something real and unresolved. The hosts exchanged brief glances, a common live television cue that time was being watched closely and the segment needed to maintain balance. As part one of the segment continued, the conversation remained anchored in civility, but the underlying tension was now clearly established. Viewers watching live could sense that this was no longer just a promotional interview. It had become a genuine exchange of viewpoints, handled carefully, but with enough pushback to make the moment feel authentic. The groundwork had been laid for the discussion to deepen further, with Sunny Hostin's questions opening a door that couldn't easily be closed without further clarification and response. As the segment moved forward, the shift in tone became more noticeable, not because voices were raised, but because the pacing of the conversation changed. There was less casual overlap between speakers and more deliberate pauses, the kind that signal everyone at the table understands the topic now requires care. Chris Evans remained composed, but viewers could see he was choosing his words more carefully than earlier in the segment. Sunny Hostin, for her part, maintained steady eye contact, signaling that she wasn't trying to provoke a reaction, but genuinely seeking clarity. Hostin continued by framing her next point in the context of the show's audience. She reminded viewers that many people watching at home juggle multiple jobs, family responsibilities, and financial stress, and may not feel they have the luxury to engage with civic issues in the same way public figures do. Her delivery was calm, almost conversational, but the substance of what she was saying carried weight. She asked Evans whether he thought his message sometimes reached people who were already engaged, while missing or alienating those who felt left out of the conversation altogether. Evans nodded as she spoke, a subtle acknowledgement that he was listening closely. When he responded, he leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. He said he believed engagement looks different for everyone, and that even small acts, like staying informed or having conversations within one's own community, mattered. He emphasized that he never expected people to mirror his level of access or resources. His tone was measured, and there was no sign of defensiveness, but there was a clear desire to be understood. One of the co-hosts interjected briefly, noting that the issue of celebrity voices in public discourse has been debated for decades, and that audiences often project expectations onto famous people that may not be fair or realistic. The comment seemed intended to broaden the discussion and relieve some of the pressure building between Evans and Hostin. The studio audience responded with light applause, appreciative of the reminder that the topic was complex. Sunny Hostin acknowledged the point, but returned to her original concern. She pointed out that even when celebrities speak with good intentions, the power imbalance remains. She asked Evans directly whether he thought there was a responsibility to amplify voices rather than add another prominent one to the mix. Her question was precise, and it landed quietly but firmly. There was a brief silence after she finished speaking, the kind that often occurs on live television when a question resonates beyond the table. Evans took a breath before answering. He said that amplification was something he cared deeply about, and that he often tried to use his platform to highlight organizations, activists, and experts who were doing the work on the ground. He admitted, however, that navigating when to speak and when to step back was an ongoing learning process. His admission seemed to soften the room slightly. The audience reacted with a few nods and scattered applause, responding to the candor rather than any specific stance. The conversation then turned briefly towards social media, with Hostin noting that comments made in interviews or on talk shows can quickly be taken out of context once clips circulate online. She asked whether Evans felt pressure knowing that even a nuanced conversation like the one they were having could be reduced to a headline or a short clip. Evans smiled faintly at that, acknowledging that it was an unavoidable part of modern media. He said it was one of the reasons he tried to speak slowly and thoughtfully, even if it meant sounding less polished in the moment. As Evans spoke, the camera occasionally cut to the other hosts, who listened attentively. Their body language suggested agreement that this was a familiar challenge for anyone in the public eye. One host nodded along, while another glanced toward the audience, gauging their reaction. The studio remained quiet, engaged, and respectful, reinforcing the sense that this was a conversation viewers were following closely. Sunny Hostin then shifted slightly, clarifying that her pushback wasn't personal. She explained that her role on the show often involved asking the uncomfortable questions that viewers at home might be thinking but wouldn't have the chance to voice. Her tone softened just a bit, and she smiled briefly, signaling that the exchange was rooted in dialogue, not conflict. Evans responded with appreciation, saying he respected that role and valued spaces where differing viewpoints could be explored openly. Despite the mutual respect, the tension didn't fully dissipate. Hostin pressed one more time on the idea of accountability, asking whether Evans felt that celebrities should be prepared for criticism if they choose to engage in public debates. Evans agreed without hesitation, stating that criticism was part of the responsibility that came with visibility. He said he didn't expect universal agreement and believed disagreement, when respectful, was healthy. The audience responded more audibly here, with a wave of applause that suggested approval of the exchange's tone, even if opinions varied. It was a moment where the discussion felt balanced, neither side dominating, but both articulating their perspectives clearly. The hosts exchanged brief smiles, recognizing that the segment was walking the line between serious discussion and daytime accessibility. As the conversation continued, the producers subtly steered things back toward Evans's current project, a common technique to maintain the show's structure. However, the earlier tension lingered beneath the surface. Even as Evans spoke about his work again, references to responsibility and public perception remained woven into his answers. Hostin listened without interruption this time, her earlier points having already been made. For viewers watching live, part 2 of the segment felt like the heart of the exchange. It wasn't about winning an argument, but about laying out differing perspectives in real time. The pushback Evans faced from Sunny Hostin was firm but measured, and his responses reflected an awareness of the complexity involved. The conversation had matured into something more reflective, setting the stage for how the hosts would eventually bring the segment to a close without erasing the questions that had been raised. As the discussion moved deeper into the segment, the atmosphere at the table settled into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. The earlier moments of tension had not disappeared, but they had transformed into something more controlled and reflective. Chris Evans continued speaking about his project, but his answers now naturally circled back to the broader themes that had emerged earlier. It was clear to anyone watching that the conversation had shifted permanently, even as the show attempted to maintain its usual structure. One of the hosts asked Evans how his personal experiences had shaped his views on responsibility and public voice, giving him space to contextualize his comments beyond headlines and sound bites. Evans responded by describing how his perspective had evolved over time, particularly as he became more aware of how differently people interpret messages depending on their own circumstances. His tone remained calm and conversational, and he avoided sweeping statements, instead focusing on his own learning process. Sunny Hostin listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed but attentive. When Evans finished, she picked up on a specific phrase he had used about learning in public. She noted that while growth is important, learning in front of millions of viewers can sometimes come at the expense of those affected by the issues being discussed. Her point was delivered evenly, but it reintroduced a subtle edge to the exchange. The studio audience reacted with a low murmur, recognizing the weight of the observation. Evans acknowledged the concern, saying that it was something he wrestled with and didn't take lightly. He explained that he often consulted with people more knowledgeable than himself before speaking out, but admitted that mistakes were still possible. He emphasized that accountability meant listening when those mistakes were pointed out, rather than becoming defensive. His response was met with a brief, polite round of applause, more reflective than enthusiastic. The camera cut briefly to the other hosts, one of whom nodded in agreement, while another folded her hands, signaling the conversation was touching on shared values around dialogue and responsibility. The show's moderator gently stepped in to keep the exchange moving, asking how Evans balanced personal beliefs with the expectations placed on him by fans. It was a softer question, but it kept the focus on the same themes. Evans answered by saying that he tried to separate his work as an actor from his role as a citizen, even though he knew the public often blurred those lines. He said he never expected agreement from everyone, and that he viewed disagreement as part of a healthy society. His voice remained steady, and his body language suggested openness rather than frustration. Sunny Hostin followed up by pointing out that disagreement is healthy only when power dynamics are acknowledged. She explained that when someone with a massive platform speaks, their words can overshadow others, even unintentionally. Her tone was calm, but there was firmness in her delivery, and the room grew quieter as she spoke. It was one of those moments on daytime television where the audience senses the hosts are speaking not just to the guest, but to the broader cultural conversation. Evans responded by agreeing in principle, saying that he didn't want to dominate conversations or drown out other voices. He reiterated that his intention was to encourage engagement and support causes, not position himself as an authority. He admitted that the balance was difficult and that he didn't always get it right. The honesty in his response seemed to resonate, drawing another small wave of applause from the audience. At this point, the conversation began to show signs of fatigue, not in interest, but in the natural limits of a live segment. The moderator glanced toward the camera, aware of timing constraints, and signaled a transition. Before moving on completely, Sunny Hostin offered a brief summary of her perspective, stating that while she appreciated Evans's willingness to engage, she believed ongoing self-reflection was essential for anyone using a large platform. Evans nodded in acknowledgement, thanking her for the thoughtful questions. He said he welcomed conversations like this because they challenged him to think more critically about his role in public discourse. The exchange ended on a note of mutual respect, even if full agreement had not been reached. The studio audience responded with steady applause, not loud or dramatic, but sustained enough to signal appreciation for the discussion's tone. The other hosts smiled and added short, affirming comments, reinforcing the idea that respectful disagreement was a valuable part of the show's identity. As the segment moved toward its later moments, the earlier tension lingered as an undercurrent rather than a focal point. Viewers at home could sense that something meaningful had taken place, even if it didn't result in a clear resolution. The conversation had unfolded in real time, with pauses, clarifications, and subtle shifts in tone that felt authentic to live television. Part 3 of the exchange demonstrated how a daytime talk show can hold space for nuanced disagreement without veering into spectacle. Chris Evans had faced firm but measured pushback from Sunny Hostin, and both had navigated the moment with professionalism. The groundwork was now laid for how the show would close out the discussion, balancing the need to wrap up the segment with the understanding that the questions raised would continue beyond the studio walls. As the show continued, the producers guided the conversation toward a more structured wrap-up, but the earlier discussion still influenced the tone at the table. The energy had settled into something quieter and more contemplative than at the start of the segment. Chris Evans remained attentive, occasionally nodding as the host spoke, while Sunny Hostin sat back slightly in her chair, her earlier points clearly stated and now resting in the background of the exchange. The moderator introduced a lighter question related to Evans's career, asking how he chooses projects at this stage in his life. It was a noticeable shift, one designed to bring the segment back to familiar daytime television territory. Evans responded thoughtfully, explaining that he looked for stories that felt meaningful to him, both personally and professionally. Even here, he connected his answer to the idea of responsibility, noting that the stories he told could influence how people see certain issues or communities. Sunny Hostin listened closely and then offered a brief follow-up, asking whether that sense of responsibility had changed the kinds of roles he accepted. Her tone was gentler now, less probing than earlier, but still engaged. Evans said it had, adding that he was more aware of the messages embedded in the work he chose. He spoke calmly, without self-congratulation, framing it as an ongoing process rather than a fixed standard. The other hosts joined in with supportive comments, sharing their appreciation for guests who reflect on the broader impact of their work. This collective response helped ease the residual tension, reminding viewers that the show often thrives on layered conversations that move between light and serious topics. The studio audience responded with relaxed applause, signaling a return to a more familiar rhythm. Still, there were moments when the earlier pushback resurfaced subtly. When Evans mentioned being mindful of his influence, Sunny Hostin nodded, but added that mindfulness had to be paired with action and listening. It was a brief comment, not framed as a challenge, but it reinforced her earlier stance. Evans acknowledged the point with a simple agreement, saying that listening was essential and that he tried to make space for it in his life. The exchange at this stage felt less like a debate and more like a reflective conversation. The host spoke in turn, careful not to overlap, and Evans responded without rushing. The camera lingered on faces longer than usual, capturing small expressions, nods, and thoughtful pauses that conveyed the tone of the moment. There was no sense of conflict escalating, but rather of a conversation winding down with its key points intact. As the segment neared its end, the moderator summarized the discussion, highlighting Evans's project and acknowledging the broader conversation about public voice and responsibility that had emerged. It was a careful summary, neutral in tone, designed to honor both the guest and the questions raised by the hosts. Evans thanked the panel for the opportunity to discuss these issues openly, saying he appreciated spaces where nuance was welcomed. Sunny Hostin responded with a brief closing remark, reiterating that her questions came from a place of wanting accountability and clarity for viewers. She smiled lightly, signaling that there was no lingering personal tension. Evans returned the smile, and the two exchanged a polite nod, a small but visible gesture that the moment had been handled professionally. The studio audience applauded as the segment wrapped, the sound steady and warm rather than exuberant. It was the kind of applause that suggests appreciation rather than excitement, fitting for the tone the conversation had taken. The hosts thanked Evans again, and the show prepared to move on to the next segment. For viewers watching live, Part 4 felt like the calm after a thoughtful exchange. The pushback Evans faced earlier had not derailed the segment, but it had shaped it, giving the conversation more depth than a standard promotional appearance. The show had managed to maintain its daytime format while allowing space for a serious, measured discussion. As the cameras pulled back and the transition music began, the sense was that the conversation, though technically finished on air, would likely continue elsewhere. The points raised by Sunny Hostin and the responses offered by Chris Evans had been clear enough to prompt reflection, but open-ended enough to invite further discussion beyond the studio. The segment closed without resolution, but with mutual respect, setting the stage for how the moment would be received once it reached viewers beyond the live broadcast. As the segment officially came to an end and the show moved on, there was a noticeable shift in energy inside the studio. The applause faded, and the hosts transitioned smoothly to the next topic, but the earlier exchange lingered in the air. For those in the audience, it felt like one of those moments that doesn't dominate the entire episode, yet stands out because of its substance. Chris Evans exited the table with a calm demeanor, exchanging brief, polite words with the hosts as the cameras reset. The studio audience's reaction remained measured. There was no sense of discomfort or unresolved tension, just the quiet acknowledgement that they had witnessed a serious conversation handled with care. Some audience members could be seen nodding as the show continued, while others whispered briefly to one another, a common response when a discussion touches on broader social themes. The atmosphere suggested that the exchange had prompted thought rather than division. Once the episode aired, viewer reactions began to surface across social media and comment sections. Many viewers noted Sunny Hostin's line of questioning, describing it as firm but fair. Some praised her for voicing concerns they felt were often left unspoken during celebrity interviews. Others focused on Chris Evans's responses, highlighting his calm demeanor and willingness to engage without deflecting or dismissing criticism. The conversation online mirrored the tone of the segment itself, with a range of perspectives expressed without a single dominant narrative taking hold. Clips from the exchange circulated, though mostly in longer form rather than short, sensational snippets. Viewers shared moments where Evans spoke about listening and accountability, as well as Hostin's comments about power and platform. The absence of raised voices or dramatic gestures meant the discussion didn't trend for shock value, but it did attract attention from those interested in thoughtful media moments. Several commentators pointed out that the exchange reflected what daytime talk shows can offer when they allow room for nuance. In the hours following the broadcast, entertainment and media writers referenced the segment while discussing the evolving role of celebrities in public discourse. Rather than framing it as a confrontation, most described it as a respectful pushback that encouraged deeper conversation. The language used in recaps focused on the substance of the questions and answers, reinforcing the idea that the moment was notable for its tone rather than any conflict. Sunny Hostin addressed the segment briefly in later interviews and on social platforms, reiterating that her questions were rooted in representing the audience and encouraging transparency. She emphasized that respectful disagreement was a core part of the show's identity. Chris Evans, for his part, did not issue a formal response, But he continued promoting his project in subsequent appearances with a similar level of thoughtfulness, suggesting the exchange had not derailed his public messaging. In the days that followed, fans and viewers continued to discuss the segment, often citing it as an example of how live television can facilitate meaningful dialogue without resorting to spectacle. Some viewers said the conversation made them reconsider how they interpret celebrity commentary, while others felt affirmed in their belief that public figures should be open to scrutiny. The lack of a definitive conclusion on air seemed to invite ongoing discussion rather than shutting it down. From a production standpoint, the show handled the moment smoothly. There were no visible attempts to cut away or redirect abruptly, and the hosts allowed the conversation to unfold within the natural constraints of the format. This approach reinforced the authenticity of the exchange, making it feel less like a planned segment and more like a genuine moment that emerged organically. As the episode settled into memory, the exchange between Chris Evans and Sunny Hostin stood out not because of drama, but because of restraint. It demonstrated how a daytime talk show can navigate complex topics while maintaining civility and balance. For viewers, it was a reminder that disagreement on live television doesn't have to be loud to be impactful. In closing, moments like this often resonate beyond their airtime because they reflect real conversations happening in everyday life. The segment ended without clear winners or losers, but with perspectives laid out honestly and respectfully. That, more than anything, defined how the exchange was received. If you watched the segment, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.